Hello, all. Welcome to the Random Thought Pod. I am your random thought leader, Bridge Lavoie, and today I am here with Dana Hicks, the author of The Knot: How to Secure Healthy Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. Hello, Dana. Welcome to the Random Thought Pod.
Thanks, Bridge. Thanks so much for reaching out. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's funny, like when you like book titles, I always like shorten book titles. Like it's always like The Knot, and it's like, and I'll forget what the rest of it is.
Right.
It's just funny how those book titles work that way. I guess nobody ever has an actual short book title, do they?
Well, you probably aren't surprised to hear that we spent a disproportionate amount of time talking about the title and how we were the subtitle and trying to wordsmith all that to make it, be what we want it to be. But yeah, it took several iterations of working through it to try to get to that title and to try to keep it simple.
Yeah, I can see that, because it's like if somebody is going to read a book called The Knot, it's like, well, I don't know what it's going to be about. So you need that subtitle, don't you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I didn't
All
want,
right.
and what's funny too, and I'm sure this will come up in our conversation, but I mean, it's not a typical marriage book. It's not like here's 10 steps to a better marriage kind of thing. That's not where I'm going with it. It's hopefully it's a random thought sort of leadership, right? I guess same kind of deal.
Yeah.
It's trying to take a fresh look at the institution itself. So
yeah, no, and that's eye-opening. It's funny, like I don't realize until I go to like review my notes on a podcast, like to that how much like the books I read actually impact me, because I'll read it and I'll be like, oh, I thought I came up with that myself, but it's like, no, I think I got it from this book. So this is always very helpful. I love this. It's like, and there'll be times where I'm like reading a book and I'll say to my wife, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to talk to the author about this part. And she just kind of looks at me like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I get to talk to the authors, the books I read.
That's fun. Yeah.
It's sounds kind of imaginary. Okay, so tell me a bit about yourself. You used to be a pastor. Yeah. You had two marriages which ended. Then you wrote a book about marriage.
Yes. The natural path that all marriage authors take, for sure. Yeah. And in the preface of the book, it's funny. I originally thought I'm going to write this book anonymously, because once people figure out that I've been divorced twice, they're going to discount everything I have to say about marriage. That's all they're going to hear, kind of thing. And actually, it was my friend Tom that said, No, you just got to lean into this and just, kind of recognize it for what it is, that this is just part of your experience. And so, yeah, I was a pastor for 30 years in evangelical tradition, mostly in the evangelical tradition. Spent the last 3 or 4 years in the United Methodist Church, but pastor for a long, long time. And unrelated to my marriages, ended up walking away from that, more related to COVID and everything that was going on. And that was sort of a perfect storm of why I didn't want to be in that world anymore. But got married for the first time when I was really young, right out of college. I married my college sweetheart, and we were married about 19 years, and that didn't work out. And then remarried a few years after that to another woman that didn't work out real well either. And so we were together about 9 years. And so, yeah, I kind of was pretty burned out on the institution, I think, at that point. And but I think when I started actually writing this, I met somebody that sort of helped me rethink my way through a lot of these issues emotionally. And then felt like there was a lot of things that I couldn't say as a pastor about marriage and about what I was sort of observing in the people that I was pastoring, that I thought, I got to put this down on paper, because I think it's important. I think there's an important conversation to be had here. And the book isn't intended to be a like, hey, here's the answer, but it's a way of sort of opening up a conversation to say, I think we can rethink marriage. It's been rethought in the past. It's been reimagined in the past, and I think we can reimagine it for the future. And the world is changing, obviously, and the institution needs to be able to flex with it as the world changes.
Yeah, and I found that very eye opening. Like to consider, like I just never thought about how much marriage has changed over time. So you say that there's a 50-50 chance of marriage failing. Actually, I hear that all the time. That wasn't a unique thought. No. But you talk about how statistics are different in the church than outside of it. How do they differ, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, that 50-50 thing gets thrown out a lot. Of course, there's a lot of nuance to that. 50-50 is a broad oversimplification. The
Yeah.
second marriages, don't do as well as first marriages. Third marriages don't do as well as second marriages, and so on. If you live in poverty, your divorce rate is much higher than if are middle class, solidly middle class or upper middle class. I mean, there's a lot of variables, obviously. If you come from a healthy family, you're going to, your odds of having a successful marriage, or a lengthy marriage anyway, certainly goes up. There's a lot of variability in all that. And then part of the weird thing about that 50% statistic is that the way they often measured it in the past was they would go to a particular county and they would get the county records, and they'd say, well, there were 10,000 people that filed for marriage licenses last year in our county, and there were 5,000 people that filed for divorce. So that means that the divorce rate is 50%. That half the people because you don't have a crystal ball to know, that when Joe and Betty go down to file for a marriage license, whether or not they're going to make it or not. So that's how people would sort of calculate it. But then the statistics kind of started getting skewed, because what ended up happening is people started getting married less. So there were less marriage licenses coming out, but then there were still the same number of divorces. And so, again, it's hard to sort of measure, or to know what exactly that 50% means. But we do know this. We know that one of the really interesting research pieces that I came across in researching this book is that the odds of a person getting divorced increase actually if you're evangelical. And even if you're evangelical adjacent, if you live adjacent to somebody who's evangelical, your odds are go up to get divorced. And the reason that they come up, they speculate that that's the case, is that in evangelical culture, there's a lot of emphasis on getting married really young, and there's a lot of emphasis on having kids young as well. Right. Those are two very big stressors on marriages, and there's a pretty tight correlation. And the younger you get married, the higher the odds are that you get divorced. And so evangelicals get married young because, frankly, they want to get to have sex, and so as a result, their divorce rates are actually higher than the national average.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because you debate all this. Like statistics is like, I'm going to be taking biostatistics, like a course in biostatistics next year, and I'm really excited about it because I'm hoping it kind of changes the way I look at statistics, because it just seems like people use them in whatever way they want to illustrate the point they want to make, right? And so, but that's a really interesting point, because I mean, you then also talk about like Mark Gungor and how Mark Gungor argues that young men getting married, like, should get married so that they can mature. And it's like, so we're expecting these young ladies to cause these young men to mature?
Yeah, I don't want my daughters to be the guinea pigs that force some young gentleman to finally figure out to get his crap together on all this. Yeah. What an odd way to think about it, that the institution of marriage is supposed to shape people into becoming something that they're not. It's kind of frightening, and I understand that's sort of true. That obviously, I think for most people, you get married and it changes you because of the commitments that you've made, and just the dynamics of what it means to live with another human being. I mean, it forces you to change in some ways, but I'm not sure that putting that burden on the institution of marriage is very healthy, and it hasn't worked out well for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's something that's just so embedded in like purity culture. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like you can grow up together, and it's like that doesn't work for everyone. In fact, it seems like a really bad idea. Like it's insane to think that I made a life commitment at the age of 22
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
she was 20, and it's like, and it's working out, but like wow, like that's a heck of a thing to like be tied to that, and I can see why it wouldn't work for so many people. You
Yeah,
talk
and
about
just the
how
biology. I'm sorry, I was gonna say this is the biology of that, right? Your prefrontal
yeah,
frontal cortex isn't fully developed until you're what 24. So I mean,
yeah, that's right.
your ability to really reason and think through and make really good lifelong decisions.
Hmm.
I tell my kids this, in an unrelated uh, deal. When they look at getting tattoos, I tell them, I don't think there's a thought that ever went through my head before I turned the age 30 that would be worth putting on my body for the rest of
Mm,
my life.
yeah.
And the same thing with marriage, right? It's like I understand the romantic notion of marrying young, but the reality is your prefrontal cortex just isn't developed. You don't understand yourself, much less other people at that
Yeah.
age.
Well,
And it works for some. My parents
yeah.
just celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary. My
Yeah.
dad was 21, my mom was 19 when they got married.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
like I mean, crazy young, but that's how they did it back then. They got married really young and they had babies quick, um, but yeah.
I think, the interesting thing too is like I always like when I watch these like TV shows where there's like the father is like, we need to break those two up, and I'm like, good luck with that. Like, like when two kids are in love, you're not going to stop them. But I think what we can do is lessen the pressure on them to commit, because
Right.
it's like, if they're going to commit, like some of these kids are just going to commit, like they just love each other and there's no talking them out of it. And you see that
Hmm.
time and time again in our literature, like every story, like Romeo and Juliet, and it's like
Yep.
it's all like, I think it's really reflecting life, because it's like people in their 20s, you're not going to talk them out of a lot of things, but it's like, how are we conditioning them?
Hmm.
I think is like the big point here, I think. And so like monogamy itself, you say, originated as a means of protecting property. Can you talk about that?
Hmm. Yeah, and this gets way back to the very, very origins of marriage. Marriage didn't exist until the agricultural revolution. If you think about humanity and the way in which we evolved, you know, we were hunter gatherers for millions of years. We just kind of wandered around, and the idea of owning property was absurd because what's there to own? I mean,
Yeah.
you just kind of wandered around and you went from place to place, foraging for food. When when the agricultural revolution began, human beings put seeds in the ground and discovered that, whoa, plants come out when you do that. And
Mhm.
now all of a sudden there's no need to wander around. We can stay in one place. And food went from being this thing that we had to do to survive to being a pathway to wealth. And
Right.
so for the first time ever, if you owned property, if you had property, you could plant crops, you could generate wealth, and then you could ask different questions beyond the questions of survival. And so in the context of that whole agricultural revolution is where marriage begins, because now all of a sudden women went from being partners in foraging for hunting and gathering to being a patriarchy sort of develops, right? Where men do the work, women stay home, take care of the kids. I need to pass on my property and my land to my descendants, and so
Right.
I need to have legitimacy and know who really are my descendants. And so this is how marriage begins. Now I own this woman and I own these children, and I'm able to pass on my wealth to children. So marriage, that's the invention of marriage. That's when it first came about. And of course, it's evolved quite a bit over the years. But for most of marriage's history, we saw women as property of men, and as things to be controlled in a very patriarchal world. And that's not a surprise to your listeners. I mean, we still live in many ways in a patriarchal world. It still have the leftovers, residual effects of all of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it all sort of began. And so seeing women as property, and then purity came about, not so much, and you see this in the Hebrew scriptures as well. Purity comes about not because we want our women to be morally pure, but we want them to be unadulterated, in the sense of, in the same way, if you sold a cow to your neighbor, you wouldn't want the cow to have blemishes on it either. You want the cow to be perfect. In the same way, when you get a dowry for your daughter, you want your, daughter to be pure, in the sense of, they haven't been around the block kind of thing. And so, what the customer is getting is a better product. So
Wow.
purity wasn't really moral purity in the sense. It was purity in the sense of, of control.
Wow.
So again, kind of a different mindset than we have today, but understanding that that sort of baggage helps us be able to unpack that from, we still see the residual effects of that in marriage, and the way people think about marriage as well today.
Well, and I think it allows us to look at it and say, do we still need these concepts? If
Yeah.
they're not working for us, it's like, why are we holding to them? And once you look at the origin, you can say, well, maybe we don't need these things.
Yeah, and in the book, I don't really say, hey, let's throw out marriage. I say, hey, let's rethink marriage. Let's
Yeah.
rethink about, it functioned this way in the past, but can it function this way in the future? Can we think
Yeah.
about it in a new way? Can we reinvent it in a way that really makes a lot more sense to the way in which we see the world today, not reflective of some patriarchal culture from, thousands of years ago.
Exactly. So you argue that sex in the Hebrew Bible is valued for connection, bonding, and pleasure, but it doesn't have to be within marriage. Can you explain that?
It's kind of you picked up on the real controversial stuff, didn't you, Bridge? Which is good.
It's fun.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a more interesting conversation for sure. Yeah, I think the Hebrew in the Hebrew scriptures, and of course, there's not one way the Hebrew scriptures think about sex and marriage. There's many ways,
Right.
but I think certainly if you look at the Song of Solomon, for example,
Yeah.
sex and sexuality is celebrated very much so in that book. But what makes it tricky for modern Bible interpreters that hold to a traditional view of marriage, quote unquote traditional view,
Yeah.
is that the couple is clearly not married. I mean, there's indications in the Song of Solomon itself that they're not married at all. So they're getting all kinds of freaky, and they're not married, and that doesn't fit real well with purity culture in the modern evangelical sense. So I think that's sort of where I was driving at, is that, while in our modern sensibilities, I should say our modern evangelical sensibilities, that's a real red flag. The ancient Hebrews didn't think twice about it. They said, let's put it in the Bible. This is cool, So again, the way in which they saw sexuality and the way in which it related to others, I think was very different than the way evangelicals would assume that they would.
Yeah.
So in the Song of Solomon, sexuality is celebrated and seen as a way of bonding, of connecting, of intimacy, of beauty. It's a beautiful sort of thing. and it doesn't necessarily in that context have to be in the context of marriage. So there are some positive views of sexuality in the Hebrew scriptures, but they're not necessarily married views
Right.
of sexuality.
That's so interesting. Um, okay. So another wonderful controversial thing. Soulmates. You take issue with
Yeah,
the concept of a soulmate, and I kind of love that.
yeah.
So tell me why you take issue with the concept of a soulmate.
Yeah, and it's not just me. I mean, I know a lot of marriage counselors that hate this idea. This sort of and this is a romantic comedy idea that's permeated not just evangelical culture, but all of our culture. You know, the idea that there's some person that's out there somewhere that if we just find that person, they're our soulmate, the one person for us, and if we meet them and connect with them, that a relationship would be so easy because they just automatically get us. They'd understand us.
Yeah.
We'd never fight. Everything would always, be rainbows and unicorns, and everything would just be wonderful. And then, of course, what happens is that you meet a real life human being and you think they're wonderful at first, but then you discover that they are, in fact, human, and they have flaws and they have insecurities and they have foibles and they have things that drive you crazy. And then when you subscribe to this soulmate myth, then you begin to wonder, well, clearly, if they're annoying, they're not my soulmate, because if they were my soulmate, they would never annoy me. They would.
Yeah.
And so, you begin to doubt all those sorts of things, right? And then you become crushed because, oh, shoot, I married the wrong person, which means my soulmate is out there and has married the wrong person as well, the one
Yeah.
person. Uh, and again, the more you think about it, the more absurd it is.
Yeah.
But part of what makes it difficult, too, is that, again, people assume that relationships aren't work, that somehow it just happens. And if it's not, if it becomes work, then I clearly have married the wrong person, or I've clearly in a relationship with the wrong person, when in fact relationships are can be a lot of work, and that's
Well,
just the nature of them.
it's interesting because I always as a evangelical growing up, I always thought of the concept of soulmate as such like a Hollywood concept. Like so many of
Mm-hmm.
the movies are about soulmates, and then you'd see it in me being all judgmental of all these celebrities. I'm like, yeah, they believe in soulmates too, and that's why they keep getting divorced and remarried, because it's like, oops, married the wrong person, right? It was a very simplistic way of looking at it, and a good way to kind of have my Christian supremacy, right? But yeah, and so, but it's yeah, that concept of soulmate. I know one of my favorite things, my wife says all the time, is love is a choice. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I think that's what it is. It's like learning that love is a choice, and it's like if we can both choose to love, I mean, we can just keep doing this forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, sometimes you have roadblocks with that, and maybe there is, incompatibilities, but it's like, it blows my mind though, how the concept of soulmate goes beyond people of faith. It's like, I don't believe in
Mm-hmm.
God, but I believe in a soulmate. And it's like, it's just
Mm-hmm.
this lore that's been kind of embedded in our society. Even as it becomes secular, it's like there's still this concept that there's one person out there for you. And it's like, how does anybody believe this?
Yeah, yeah, and it's not an old concept. It's a relatively new idea. Um, that sort of came about with the invention of romantic marriage, and romantic
Mm,
marriage is again, as we kind of briefly touched on, marriage has changed quite a bit over the centuries, and the way, even though we still call it marriage, it's almost unrecognizable from when it started. And it wasn't until 200 years ago that people uh, had this romantic notion that they would marry for love, or that they would be the ones who decided who they would marry. For most of human history, the vast majority of human history, people realized that the decision of who to marry was way too of an important decision to leave to horny teenagers. It just was too important of a decision.
Yeah.
And so parents would make those decisions, on behalf of them, because
Right.
a marriage affected the entire family. It wasn't just, two, isolated individuals who were getting married. It wasn't until 200 years ago that we began this romantic notion that somehow each person had their own autonomy to be able to pick a person that they could spend the rest of their life with, and they would get married for reasons of love. For most of human history, people got married for reasons other than love. They got,
Right.
or at least romantic love. They would marry mostly for survival. Frankly,
Yeah.
I mean, you had to have a partner to farm with you and to make kids so that you had more people to farm and work on the farm. And oftentimes you would marry because there was you're making connections with the next village over or with the next group of people, and it was politically expedient in order to marry, and so that your cattle could graze on other lands and things like that. There are very practical reasons to get married that revolved around survival. And again, it wasn't until 200 years ago that we thought that we should marry for love. And so this is all very new, and what we're discovering is that romantic love is actually not a very good foundation for getting married. Which is really, that's a real bummer for a lot of people to hear, because we're very romantic people, and we have very romantic notions of love and marriage.
Interesting. Well, I mean, and I think we'll get into this later, but it's just kind of like, well, like, this is assuming that marriage has to be for life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what's the best way to get married so that it'll last for your entire life? Which seems like an impossibility. Like when we talk too about like couples that have been together forever, when we talk about like a 60-year marriage, we can say,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that marriage has lasted 60 years, therefore that's a successful marriage. But it's like, what are our metrics? If our metric is only longevity, we're not really, looking at marriage for all it's worth, because it's like, it
Mm-hmm.
could be a terrible marriage for 60 years. When you
Right.
have it like hyper patriarchal and it's like she's just meeting his every need all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. We're calling that successful. It's like, I think we need better metrics for marriage, shouldn't we?
Yeah, there seems to be more to being married than not getting divorced, maybe, is one way
Yeah.
to say it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. And I think, we do celebrate. Again, my parents had their 60th wedding anniversary
Yeah.
this summer, and I'm close enough to them to know that their marriage wasn't perfect, by
Yeah.
any means. And there was some. I won't get into my parents' marriage, but
No, it's
especially on
fine.
this podcast. But yeah, I mean, just because you survived it doesn't mean it was necessarily good. And I think that's part of their generation. That's part of the reason that they could get married at 19, 20, 21 years old and stick it out for 60 years, was that I don't think they, in some ways, had assumptions of happiness. They had lower
Yeah.
expectations for marriage, I think, than people do now. I think that's
Yeah.
part of it. And I touch on this in the book, that as marriage has evolved even more since we began marrying for love, people put higher and higher and higher expectations on what marriage could be.
Ooh, yeah.
So that could be okay if you actually meet those expectations. It's pretty cool. There's a researcher named Eli Finkel that I talk a lot about in the book, who I think is just doing really fascinating research out of Northwestern University on marriage. And his contention is exactly that the higher we've sort of gone up in our expectations for marriage, the higher the divorce rate gets, because
Yeah.
because the more likely you'll be disappointed. If all your expectation in marriage is just to survive and make it to the next day, you'll probably be married for life.
Yeah.
I mean, well, you
Yeah.
will be by definition, I guess. But if your expectation is that your spouse will be your best friend and your lover and will somehow meet every emotional need that you possibly have and make you a self-actualized human being. Um, Most of us are not going to have that. I mean, just to be really frank about it, I mean, that's really difficult, and it takes a lot
Yeah.
of time. And it takes, most of us have jobs and
Yeah.
kids and responsibilities and things that we're doing. And so it puts a lot of weight on a marriage to have really super high expectations for it. And when you have, I mean, expectations are easy, when we have high expectations, they're easily thwarted. And
Yeah.
so when we're disappointed, that's when those marriages end. And so I think the book is an attempt to say, hey, for some of us, I think we need to reevaluate our expectations of of what marriage is and what we get out of this. If because divorce sucks, and I can tell you
Yeah.
twice over, it
I bet.
sucks, and it's hard, it's difficult.
Yeah.
It tears at the fabric of there's kids involved. I mean, there's collateral damage beyond just the two of you as well,
Yeah.
and it's financially it sucks. I mean, there's a lot of things that are just awful about it, and so I think, again, part of my motivation in writing is trying to help people not have to go through that kind of pain.
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking, I think about it too. Like, it's like when you get married, you're like, okay, so what is a normal marriage supposed to look like? When in reality,
Hmm.
it could be like, hey, you two kids figure it out. Like, you can make your marriage whatever you want it to be.
Hmm.
It's like,
Hmm.
what's working for you? And like, I'm realizing more and more too that it's like, I have my own things, she has her own things, and sometimes things intertwine. And I think my
Hmm.
expectation starting out was that we would have things together all the time. And so, like,
Hmm.
learning that togetherness and that separateness, I think that might be the key to a happy marriage right there, is like figuring out your separateness and your togetherness and just setting that up, because it's like you
Right.
cannot. And I think you talk about this in the book too, to get back to your book, um, about how, like, not every, you can't expect that one person to meet your every need. It's like we need, you know, a society. We need to live within society, engage with people who meet our needs, rather than just
Hmm.
finding that one
Hmm.
person that meets our needs.
Right. Yeah, that illusion. Again, it's the soulmate illusion that there's a super person out there, a superman, a superwoman
Super person.
that's gonna that's gonna meet all of those. Yeah, and I had that expectation too at 23, the first time I
Yeah.
got married, that we're gonna
Yeah.
do everything together. We're gonna
Yeah.
we're gonna think exactly alike, and we're gonna have the same hobbies and same interests, and yeah, you quickly figure out that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. I'm 22 years in. So,
Oh, good
yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good run. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Hopefully it's not over, but
yeah.
keep, keep
Still
that run
going.
going there, Chris.
You argue that up until the 18th century, Christian virtues were collective,
Hmm.
but they then became individualistic. Can you explain
Yeah.
that? I found that really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And this gets back again to the purity culture and notions of romantic marriage and how those things all were kind of intertwined into one big mess. For most of Christian history, Jesus defined, what it meant to be a good neighbor in pretty specific ways, about, loving people who were marginalized, who people we came in contact with, whose lives were falling apart, people who were poor, and people who um, were sick. And for most of Christian history, that was the case. That's the way we measured whether or not we were doing our job right as followers of Jesus. And what it meant to be a virtuous person was that we were engaged in our communities. We were engaged in ways that made our communities a better place because those were the priorities of Jesus. But then we made this really weird left turn in which we began to define virtue not in terms of how the value that we brought to our communities, but we defined virtue in terms of our private passions. In other words, how we were able to be quote unquote pure sexually. And so, I mean, and I grew up again in evangelical world, like you did, Bridge, to where I really, every time I heard about righteousness or unrighteousness or holiness or unholiness, I always thought about it in terms of sexuality. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just it's a bizarre sort of way of seeing the world. But that was the shift that happened a couple hundred years ago in terms of theologically, we quit thinking of virtue in terms of the way in which we saw our neighbors and saw it instead in terms of our own private passions.
Hmm. Yeah. And that I like to call it masturbation Christianity. When I was in creative writing, actually in high school, I was kind of surprised to hear my teacher say this, but he was like, "Don't write masturbation poetry." And then he explained how it's like poetry that's good for you, but it's not good for anyone else. And so I'm like, I was going to write a book actually called Masturbation Christianity, but it's really bad. Like I'm realizing I'm like I stepped away from reading scripture for like 4 months, and now I'm re-engaging it, and I'm just doing like one of these like devotionals on the U version of the Bible. And every time I read the devotional, it's like I'm rewriting it in my brain. I'm like, no, actually, this is what I think. and and because I think what really turned me off of the Bible for a moment was like when you talk about the whole David and Bathsheba thing, and there's all the controversy around that where people are just like, no, Bathsheba sinned. It wasn't just David that sinned, and all this stuff, right? And it's like, well, it's like David, and we can talk. I've talked about this ad nauseum, but what I find so staggering about all of this is that is like David called this woman to his chamber. She didn't have any choice. Like, there's no way she would have had any choice in the matter. And then Uriah, like, he murders Uriah to like cover up the fact that he banged this lady,
Yeah.
and got her pregnant. And then what does he do? He goes into the Psalms. And this was like one of the devotionals I was in where they just like totally were like, oh, this is the Psalm David wrote after he did all that stuff with Bathsheba. And it's like, and he says, against you and you alone have I sinned. And I was like, oh, this is what I am hating so much about Christianity right now is like, I just want to be right with God. And it's like, I need to be right with you so I can I with God. And it's like, and you're short circuiting like your relationships with other people.
There.
Sorry?
I'd say Uriah may have some things to say about who was sinned against in that context. Yeah.
Well, it's the difference between there's a creator, I don't know what her name is. I'll put it in the show notes. But there's this creator who talks about horizontal versus vertical morality and how a lot of Christians are kind of stuck in vertical morality, which totally ignores like horizontal morality, and our world is kind of stuck in horizontal morality where it's like, how are you treating other human beings, right? And a lot of our culture, when it comes to like challenging the behavior of individuals is like, how are you treating other people? And the church is just like, oh, that's so dumb. Like, no, you need to be right with God. And it's like, and so I'm like, I'm realizing now that
I'm sorry. I was just going to say now that I'm kind of outside of the church world and I'm working in a secular environment. It strikes me how absurd that is to people who aren't part of that. It's like, oh no, it doesn't matter if I'm a total asshole to you. So long as God loves me, I'm okay. It's like, whatever, dude.
I'm glad God forgave you, but we still hate you. Yeah. And I guess what I'm realizing now is like I got so interested in humanism, and I thought humanism's just this most beautiful thing. It's like, let's just make the world a better place. And so now that I'm re-engaging scripture, I'm like, I'm a humanist first and a theologian second. And I like to argue that Jesus was the same. Like when people were like, he went and healed someone on the Sabbath, and someone's like, "Hey, you can't do that." And he's like, actually, he's like, man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man.
Right.
Which we'll get to your turn on that.
Yeah.
In a bit.
Yeah. Let me piggyback on the David and Uriah thing too, because what I think is interesting in that, when it's Nathan the prophet that comes to David, right, and tells the parable of the lamb and the the man who had all the sheep and the guy who only had one lamb and the rich man who stole his lamb and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then you're the man, David. He does the little twist and then David, oh, you're right, I did. I stole this guy's lamb. Again, there's a mindset there. There's a patriarchal ownership sort of thing.
Yeah, 100%.
That's going on there. Yeah, know that nobody questions that. That like Uriah clearly owned Bathsheba, and 100%. You stole her possession. That's the sin. Your sin is against Uriah. Your sin is not against Bathsheba or the way in which you exploited her, or sexually harassed her. Really, he says he raped her.
And it's like, and she's not a person; she's property.
Right. Yeah. So when you're doing your devotionals, keep that in mind. Yeah, there's 100%. There's another world that's going on, and I don't like it personally. That's not the way I see the world. That's not the way I choose to see the world. That's not the way I think that we move forward in the universe to make this place a better place for our kids.
Yeah, we can be better. Like it's like we can take it next step. And that's one of the things. So the previous podcast episode was on being post-Christian. And it's Maria Francesca. Oh, I forgot her last name. It was fantastic. But it's kind of like it's moving beyond, kind of the baby food of Christianity, which is what kind of Keith Giles argues in Sola Deus. I always want to say deuce. I make that joke every time. Deuce. But he kind of argues like how it's like, we kind of have these basics teachings that are in the scriptures, but it's like we can build beyond that. Like we can move on beyond that. And it's like we don't have to see women as property, just like we don't have to be okay with slavery, right? Like we can build on it. What's the spirit behind this, and it's like what's the progression that scripture's trying to give us? And it's like, if we can do that, I think scripture can still be useful. But if we're going to use it to like try to, go back to when women were property, it's like, I don't, and there's so many people that are trying to do that. And it's like so depressing to see that. I'm like, why are you guys trying to make everything worse?
Yeah. Maybe it seems simple. I'm not sure either. But yeah.
Well, it's easier to like just look at it and say it's black and white, it's written here. And it's like, we'll just do what's written here. And it's like, yeah, well then you don't have to do all this growing as a human being. Like it's the same people too that are just kind of like, God never changes. And it's like, yeah, you seem to be saying that so you don't have to change. Okay, so you have a bit of a beef with the concept of purity. Can you outline some of the uses you have with purity as a virtue? Like, I think you touched on this a bit, but do you think there's a little more you have to say about that?
Yeah, the notion of purity, I think, just generally can be really dangerous. And Brian McLaren does a lot of work on this that I really like. He talks about how if we define ourselves in terms of purity and lack of purity, that means I'm pure and people who are not like me are unpure. And if you are unpure, then all of a sudden you are a little less human than me. And so there's this sort of logical progression of, and if you look at every genocide that's ever taken place in human history, what's the language that they use, right? I mean, they use the language of unpurity. And so I think it's a pretty dangerous slope to be on when we start using that kind of language of pure and unpure. because when we begin to see people in those sorts of ways, we begin to dehumanize them, and that's a short step from, well, killing them, frankly. And so yeah, there's a lot of dangers in that beyond just even, you know, it messes up people's sexualities,
Totally.
which, I mean, I again, 30 years as a pastor, you see a lot of stuff, and I think purity culture has done so much damage to people's sense of sexuality. You know that it's really really hard for some people to get over that. I mean, their sense of sexuality just in and of itself being an unpure thing. You know, because we tell kids all the time, right? You know, or evangelicals tell kids, you know, remain pure, remain pure, remain pure, and then on your wedding night, flip a switch and go crazy,
Yeah.
and and you know,
That's
it
a
for
big
some
thing
reason it
too, like for a like young marriage to recover from, because it's
yeah.
like this young man now, he's like, okay, now I'm going to try all the stuff, right? And it's like I have the right now to
Mm-hmm.
try all the stuff, and it's like this is not like the objectification, right? It's not this thing that's mutual. It's more like, okay, now I can unleash all of my nasty desires. And like, and I
All the
think like
pent
for
up
me too, and
frustrations of
I don't think this was intentional in my upbringing, but I did have kind of this dichotomy between that kind of girl and the virtuous girl.
mm,
And I had this idea that there's the kind of girl I fool around with, and then there's the girl I actually marry.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
it took a lot to deconstruct that and be able to see like people as people, right? Like it's
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and so there's a lot of work to do in that, that like you
mm-hmm,
said, pure and unpure. It's like if we're going to, you know, make that dichotomy, it's like we're going to dehumanize those who are not pure. And that's a big
mm-hmm.
problem.
Yeah, and you know the technical phrase that you're talking about, Bridge. This came about. It was Sigmund Freud saw this like 150 years ago. He called it the Madonna whore complex, and we still have that
Mm,
around, right? You know, this
mm,
idea that men desire the whore but want to marry the Madonna.
yeah.
And so we want, you know, men want to marry somebody who's pure and, you know, innocent and is not sexual, sort of asexual, and marry them, have children with them, and whatnot. But really, what they desire is the whore. You know, that we
Mm,
somehow separate. You know, and I'm talking about men in a very stereotypical way.
yeah. Yeah.
That we have a tendency, that there's a cultural tendency, and this just isn't among evangelicals. This is among uh, probably all of Western culture, right? To separate women as either things that we desire and respect, uh, and or as either something we respect and want to be a part of, or somebody that we just use and desire.
Right.
And for some reason, it's harder for men to sort of make that connection between the two. And women aren't stupid. They certainly they pick up on that, and they
Yeah.
know that if they act like a whore, that they're not going to be respected. And if they, but yet they also, I mean, they're sexual beings too. You know,
Yeah.
just like men are, and so trying to work again. There's just so many layers to this purity culture that sort of messed us up. In the
Yeah.
way in which we see it. And again, it's not even evangelicals. I mean, this is true of Western civilization generally speaking.
Well, that's and I think that's something that's so beautiful about like the sex positivity movement is like to see like, you know, I have lots of friends on Twitter that'll post like thirst traps and stuff like that, and I'm like, it's beautiful. You're hot. Like we can be cool with that. And I'm realizing that there's this, you know, for me, it's like I'm fostering the ability to admire beauty without wanting to exploit it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, and I think that is the sweet spot for me anyways. That's where I'm at. Like I'm just like it's because I'm like I am a sexual being and I can say that's, you know, that is a beautiful person. and be cool with that. And that's as far as
Yeah.
it goes, right? I'm not going to be
Uh-huh.
going and DMing them now, right? That's when I'm crossing the line, right? And so,
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about
mhm,
it until you just mentioned it, and I haven't thought this through a whole lot, but I think you're onto something, Bridge. I think that evangelical culture doesn't make that differentiation. We always, it jumps from desire. You don't want to desire somebody because you'll exploit them, and
mhm,
there's no differentiation between desire and exploitation, which is why modest is hottest or whatever. I mean, they have this sort of mentality that, well, women can't, dress in a particular way because men will exploit them, you
yeah.
know? Maybe men shouldn't do that.
I love making fun of that whole like men are visual, and I'm like, yeah, women don't have eyes. All right, so you raise a really interesting point about the pro-life movement. The Netherlands has the lowest
Yeah, you
abortion
pick
rate.
all the controversial stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We're doing all the controversy. So, Netherlands has the lowest abortion rate as a result of sex education and effective contraception. But the pro life movement is more so obsessed with trying to control people's private passions. Why do you
Hmm.
think that is?
Well, again, evangelicals are obsessed with sex. I mean,
Yeah.
it really is a bizarre obsession if you take a step back from it and look at it. I mean, the amount of time and energy that goes into thinking about sex. And when it comes to pro-life, to me, it seems really obvious. Again, once I've stepped out of that whole evangelical culture, it seems really obvious. Evangelicals aren't really interested in preventing abortions, because if they're interested in preventing abortions, they would go to the Netherlands and they would say, "Hey, they're doing really good at preventing abortions. How do we prevent abortions here and be like them?"
Yeah.
Uh, that's not the question they're asking. What they're saying is, "Oh, well, then let's do abstinence only education," which is
Yeah.
absurd.
Yeah.
I mean,
You got those
uh,
20-year-olds again. It's like you're not going to talk them out of getting it on. Like, that's.
there's no amount of rationality that's gonna. And I can tell you from being a former 16-year-old,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's no amount of rationality that's going to
No.
talk you out of that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So to me, it's obvious this is not what they're interested in, and abortion is an easy issue for evangelicals because um, the unborn they don't demand anything of us.
Right.
They don't they don't ask us to be fed. They
Yeah.
don't show up as panhandlers to us. They're not demanding more money. They ask nothing from us, and so it's really easy to advocate for them because uh, they ask no demands of us whatsoever. So it's a perfect thing for evangelicals because it's something that is a result of sex that they don't like,
Yeah.
and sex that was created from people who are impure. So it just makes a perfect issue for evangelicals in a really hypocritical way.
That's so interesting, like what you're saying, because it resonates with what I'll put a link to this podcast. There's this podcast I listened to that was all about that Sound of Freedom movie, and
Yeah, yeah,
what they were talking about is like just how unrealistic. I'm not going to see the film. I'm okay with that.
yeah.
Um, but apparently, what happens in the film is like two children are put like in a crate and shipped overseas to be sex trafficked, which they're like, that's never happened. Like that's expensive. Like why would you do that? Um, but like what they were talking about, like with like rescuing, these sex trafficking victims, and like the reality is like what's usually happening is like you have like your queer child who gets kicked out of their house and they're like couch surfing and they really need a place to stay, and someone says, yeah, you can stay here, but you have to do this thing for me, right? And that's how kids are
Hmm.
typically sex trafficked. Well, that's probably the majority of them. A lot of them are family members too, right? Um, but this whole like sex rescue thing, where it's like, we found these, like, even, these, like, it's like a massage, um, whatever, massage parlor, where they have all these women, and the police interview them, and they're like, hey, are you a prostitute or were you sex trafficked? If you're a prostitute, we'll jail you. Oh, you were sex trafficked. Okay. Right. And that's how we get kind of these like whole, like, oh, there's a ring of like sex trafficking or whatever. But even like if they are rescuing these people from sex trafficking, they then say, all right, we stop them from being sex trafficked, which means they now lost their place to stay. And if they were making money off of it, they've lost it too. But it's like that's where the Christian compassion ends. They're like, we're just going to stop them from being sex trafficked. And now they're rescued. And where do they go? Maybe a homeless shelter? I don't know. Like they are people in poverty, but it's like we just want to stop the impurity of them being sex
Right. They're not
trafficked.
interested in them as human beings, as
Yeah.
holistic human beings. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the same with abortion, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you don't hear evangelicals saying, you know, well, we know the reason you're getting this abortion is because you can't afford the kids, so come live
Yeah.
at my house. I'll
Yeah.
pay for all your health care, up through the first couple of years of this kid's life, and help, give you the financial wherewithal to be able to take care of this kid, and then we'll put it up for adoption, and you can. I mean, they're not interested in that. They
And
just
I mean,
say,
and they
"Don't
may,
do
like,
it."
there may be people who are, but by and
Hmm.
large, the movement is who cares about that? Let's
Right.
just stop the impurity portion of it.
Right. And then in terms of human trafficking too, it's like I think it's interesting that it's that the thing that gets people is sex trafficking as opposed to labor trafficking, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
live in Arizona. There are lots of people who come across the border who are undocumented,
Right.
who we have a huge shortage in construction jobs here,
Yeah.
so this is a huge issue here where I live. Um, the problem is that there's tons of exploitation that goes on with contractors who hire these, undocumented workers, and then they pay them squat. They hardly
Right.
pay them less than minimum wage. But who are they going to go to? They are essentially being trafficked as workers, right? I
Yeah.
mean, exploited as workers. I mean, it's the same
Yeah.
thing. Don't hear a lot of outrage about that,
No.
you know?
No. And
Uh,
that's, I mean, that's that dehumanization. And it's like, and there's an
mhm.
impurity because those people came into the country without documentation. So it's like we
Hmm.
dehumanize the impure again.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So you talk a bit about the concept of marriage being a temporary thing. And this is interesting because I think around the time that I actually was reading your book, there's
Hmm.
a therapist, Mike the therapist, on Twitter. I'll link him
Okay.
too. He said that we completely change our personalities every 4 years. Like it's actually like a psychological reality that our
Hmm.
personalities change. And he argues the same thing, that it's like marriage should be something that you reconsider every 4 years because you've changed who you are. There are societies in which marriage does give one chance to renew periodically. I think you talked about that, how there are chances to renew your
Hmm.
marriage.
Hmm.
I used to actually always say to my wife, I'm like, so when are our vows up for renewal? Which isn't really a concept here, but there are societies where it is. Hey.
Yeah. Well, there's societies where it's been proposed.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I there's actually an old Muslim practice of and I forget uh, uh there's a word for it that I can't remember, but they would essentially do a practice marriage. They would say, "Hey, we're going to give this a whirl for 6 months or 12 months, and at the end of that 6 or 12 months, we decide, yeah, this is something. It's like it's a test drive that they would do, and at the end it's be like, yeah, I'm not sure this is the right thing, or yeah, this is good, let's do this,
Hmm.
which is kind of interesting concept. But there was a politician in France who ran on, that was one of the platforms a few years back, who ran on the platform of all marriages will have a 7-year expiration date, and at the end of 7 years, um, you have to renew it every 7 years if you want to stay married, and with the assumption that, yeah, people change, things change, situations change, and I think part of the caveat was if you have children, it goes from every 7 years to permanent, or
Hmm.
until the kids are 18 or something like that, which is kind of interesting. But
Hmm.
um, yeah, one of the things that marriage as an institution has really that's changed over the centuries is that human beings live longer.
Right.
So when life expectancy was 35 years, when you said "till death do us part" at a wedding vow, it meant something different than now when your life expectancy might be 85, 95 years. I mean,
Right.
it's a much bigger commitment now than it
Yeah.
was, when life expectancy was a lot shorter. So that's one of the other dynamics that's taking place, sort of recognizing that human beings living longer, that creates some problems in terms of interpersonal relationships. For some people, it works fine. Some people, it's great. They adjust. Their marriage evolves over the years. They find ways to continually reinvent it and rethink about it and change with the dynamics. And every marriage does. Bridge, I'm sure you found this in your marriage. Is you go from the newlywed phase, starry eyed, to sort of like a more realistic perception of each other. And then you have kids, and then that changes the whole dynamic because now you've
Yeah.
got, you know, um, your attention's focused in other places, your affections are, and it's revolving around other things. And then as the kids grow up, that sort of changes. They become more independent, and then they leave the house, and you become empty nesters, and now you're back to this other relationship in which it's not focused around your kids, and that's a huge shift for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and then people retire, and they quit
Yeah.
working, and I have friends. I was just talking to somebody this weekend. Their partner has just retired, and they're like, I spent about as much time as I wanted to with this person before they retired, and now they're going to be around all the time. I
Wow.
don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are all, and those are just natural things that happen in every marriage as time goes on. You have crises, you have financial crises, somebody dies, a family member dies, or what. I mean, there's always things that come up that sort of throw speed bumps along the way in every marriage. That's just the nature of it. And um, so it is a huge commitment to say, till death do we part, um, with a brain that is not fully developed, and not really understanding the nature of life. Um, so I'm not, I guess to be clear, with people who haven't read the book, I'm not really advocating for, hey, all marriages should be completely temporary. I'm just simply saying, I think that marriage is different now than it used to be
Yeah.
centuries ago. And uh, when it was a time in which women had to be married in order to survive. There was a time in which that was the case. That's no longer the case. There's a lot of women that are very happy to never be married, um, and can survive just fine without a man in their life, or a partner in their life.
Hmm.
And so, the way in which we see marriage, I think, needs to adjust in terms of like uh, the social pressures, I guess, around that.
So many things we could still explore. Um, but I just want to kind of close with your extrapolation of Jesus and the Sabbath, where you said marriage was made for humankind, not humankind for marriage. Um, how do you think that shift can help us?
Yeah, and of course, I'm stealing from Jesus' words. I'm extrapolating from Jesus' words. Humankind was made for the Sabbath, not the Sabbath for humankind. sort
Or
of
the flip of
recognizing that
that.
all institutions, including things like churches and and other things, they are made for the benefit of humanity,
Right.
not humanity for their benefit. And when we
Yeah.
get that inverse thing, and then when I was a pastor, this was always, the thing that always got me into trouble, is I would say that to my denominational leaders, that the denomination exists to serve us, not you, not the local church to serve the denomination, right?
Yeah.
As long as you're serving us, it's going in the right direction. When you think that we exist to serve you, that's when things get really messed up. And the same is true with marriage. If we think that there's this sort of perfect institution out there called marriage that we all have to sort of conform to, it creates a lot of grief in our life, because none of us will attain to that particular ideal. But when we recognize that the institution is there to serve us, to make our lives better, then we can leverage it in ways that make us better human beings, make better communities, make healthier decisions, make better families, frankly, as a result of that.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the
Yeah.
podcast.
Thank you, Bridge.
How do we get my listeners in contact with your work?
Yeah, I got a webpage, danaHicks.org,
Okay.
where I just kind of post some writings and musings and whatnot, some writing projects I'm working on. You can follow me on, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. Dana Hicks Author, I think, is my Twitter handle there. There's a contact page on my website if you want to reach out to me directly. You can do that as well. But yeah, love to hear from folks. I really enjoy this conversation, and I think it's not only interesting. I think it's really important conversation to have for folks, especially people like myself. I like any author or any preacher, I write to myself first. What are the things I need to sort of articulate and be clear about in my own life, and I think for me, working through these ideas, I think was helpful.
Okay. And do pick up a copy of this book. I'll have a link to the Amazon link for that too. That's all right.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome.
Thank you.